The ballroom shimmered under the soft golden lights that reflected off the crystal chandeliers. A large crowd filled the room, dressed in elegant clothes and sparkling jewelry. Laughter and polite conversations blended with the gentle clinking of glasses. Tonight was special. It was one of those rare evenings when people came together not just to show their wealth, but to witness something extraordinary, a performance by one of the world's most celebrated pianists. The stage at the front of the room held a single grand piano, black and glossy, its lid open wide as if waiting for magic to begin. People spoke in admiration about the artist who would soon take that seat. Some had traveled across cities just to attend. Others came simply because it was fashionable to be seen at such a grand event. The pianist had a reputation not only for his unmatched talent, but also for his charm and confidence. Wherever he performed, he left the audience breathless. As the crowd continued to settle, waiters moved quietly through the aisles, offering drinks and small bites. In the corner of the room near the back table sat a woman who looked out of place. She wore a simple dress, not expensive but neat. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, and her eyes wandered around the room, taking in every detail. She wasn't talking to anyone. In fact, few even noticed her. People assumed she was someone's guest, maybe a distant friend of a staff member or a helper who had been allowed to stay for the show. But she wasn't there by accident. She loved music deeply, not the kind played for money or fame, but the kind that spoke straight to the soul. She had once known what it felt like to sit before a piano, to lose herself in melodies that told stories without words. But that was long ago. Life had taken her down a different path, one filled with responsibilities, heartbreak, and silence. She hadn't touched a piano in years. When the host finally stepped onto the stage, the chatter began to fade. The lights dimmed slightly and all eyes turned toward the shining piano. The host gave a short introduction, speaking with pride about the evening's performer, a man whose name carried weight in every music hall around the world. People applauded, eager to witness brilliance once again. The famous pianist walked onto the stage with his usual confidence, smiling as flashes from cameras lit up the room. He bowed gracefully and took his seat at the piano. The moment his fingers touched the keys, everything else disappeared. The first note rang out pure and strong, followed by a cascade of melodies that felt alive. His playing was smooth and effortless, as if the music were flowing straight from his heart. For the next hour, he performed piece after piece, each more moving than the last. The audience sat spellbound, holding their breath through every soft note and gasping with awe at every powerful crescendo. Some closed their eyes, others leaned forward, lost in the rhythm. When he finished the final piece, the hall erupted into thunderous applause. The pianist stood smiling proudly, soaking in the admiration. It was clear he was used to it. After a few minutes, the mood in the room became lighter. The host returned to the stage, joking about how no one could possibly follow such a performance. People laughed. Glasses were refilled, and the evening moved into a more relaxed phase. The pianist mingled with the guests, shaking hands and posing for photos. He loved attention almost as much as he loved music. As he moved from group to group, his gaze landed on the quiet woman in the back. Something about her calmness in the middle of all that glamour caught his attention. She wasn't clapping loudly or trying to get his autograph. She was just sitting there, her expression thoughtful. Curious, he approached her table, followed by a few amused guests. "Did you enjoy the performance?" he asked with a charming smile. The woman looked up, surprised to be addressed. She nodded politely. "Yes," she said softly. "It was beautiful." "Beautiful," he repeated, amused by her simple answer. "You say that like someone who understands music." She smiled faintly. "I used to play a little a long time ago." The guests nearby chuckled. The pianist raised his brows, his tone light but teasing. "Oh, really? Then perhaps you should play something for us." A few people laughed, thinking it was a harmless joke. The woman's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She could tell he didn't mean it seriously. But before she could respond, one of the guests encouraged, "Yes, let her play." "That would be fun." The pianist, enjoying the moment, gestured toward the piano on stage. "Come then. Let us hear how you play," he said with a grin. His voice was friendly, but there was a hint of arrogance underneath. Everyone expected her to blush and refuse politely, maybe laugh it off. After all, who would dare to play in front of a world-class pianist? The woman hesitated. She hadn't touched a piano in so long that she wasn't sure she could still remember the feeling. Yet something inside her stirred, a quiet voice reminding her of who she once was. The sound of the piano earlier that night had awakened something deep within her. Slowly, she rose from her chair. The crowd murmured in surprise. The pianist blinked, unsure if she was serious. She walked calmly toward the stage, her simple shoes echoing softly on the polished floor. For a moment, even the laughter stopped. The woman climbed the small steps, each movement steady and deliberate. The pianist stepped aside, still smiling, but now there was a trace of curiosity in his eyes. She stood before the grand piano, looking at it as if greeting an old friend. Her fingers brushed lightly against the keys, testing their cool surface. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the lights. People whispered to each other, wondering what would happen next. The pianist folded his arms, half amused and half intrigued. He expected a clumsy attempt, a few mismatched notes followed by awkward laughter. He didn't realize that this moment was about to change everything. The woman sat down on the piano bench, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes for a moment. In that silence, she remembered the long nights when she used to play just for herself, when music had been her comfort and her world. She remembered the feeling of losing herself in the sound, of creating something that came from the heart. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys. From her seat, she could see her reflection on the shiny surface of the piano's lid. A woman older now, quieter, but still carrying the spark that life hadn't fully taken away. Around her, people whispered and waited, their curiosity mixed with doubt. She didn't look up. Instead, she exhaled slowly and pressed the first key. A single soft note filled the room. It was delicate, uncertain, but it carried emotion. She paused for a heartbeat, then played another. The sound was gentle yet clear. The pianist tilted his head, watching more closely now. Something in that tone was different, pure and honest. The crowd fell silent again, sensing that this wasn't just another joke or clumsy attempt. The woman's hands began to move more confidently, and the notes started to flow together like a quiet stream. Every sound she created seemed to carry a story, a memory, a feeling, a whisper from long ago. People leaned forward, drawn in by something they couldn't explain. Even the pianist, who had started the moment as a joke, found himself unable to look away. The expression on her face had changed. She wasn't just playing. She was living inside the music. For those watching, time seemed to slow. The lights glowed softer, the chatter disappeared, and all that remained was the woman and her music. No one knew who she was, but in that instant it didn't matter. The way her fingers moved across the keys told everyone that there was much more to her than they had assumed. And as the last note lingered in the air, fading into silence, something unspoken passed through the room. A quiet sense that this night, which had begun with laughter and arrogance, was about to become unforgettable. The applause that followed her last note was hesitant at first, as if the crowd couldn't believe what they had just heard. Then, as the sound of her music faded completely, the silence broke into a wave of clapping that grew louder with every passing second. Some guests even stood up. The woman blinked, almost startled, as if waking from a dream. She looked down at her trembling hands resting on the piano keys. For a brief moment she smiled, but it was a shy, almost uncertain smile. The famous pianist who had asked her to play as a joke stood frozen beside the stage. The confident grin he'd worn earlier was gone, replaced by something softer, something close to awe. He had played in front of thousands, received standing ovations all over the world, yet what he had just heard touched him differently. There was something in the woman's playing that felt real, honest and pure, something that technique alone could never achieve. The woman slowly rose from her seat. She didn't bow or wait for praise. She simply nodded politely, stepped down from the stage, and returned to her seat in the back. The crowd continued clapping even after she sat down, some people cheering, others whispering in disbelief. A few of the guests looked embarrassed, remembering how they had laughed earlier. Now they couldn't stop talking about her. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "I thought she was just a guest," another said. "Did you hear how she played? That wasn't beginner stuff." The pianist finally collected himself and walked back to the piano. He pressed one key, letting the sound echo as if testing reality. Then he looked toward the woman and said, "That was extraordinary." His words were quiet but sincere. The room went silent again, waiting to hear what he would say next. "Would you play another piece?" The woman shook her head gently. "No," she said softly. That's enough for tonight. Her voice carried a calm strength. She wasn't refusing out of pride. It was simply that the music she had played had come from a place deep within her, a place that didn't open often. She didn't need to prove anything more. The pianist didn't push her. Instead, he nodded respectfully. "Then let me thank you," he said. He turned to the audience and added, "What you all heard tonight was not just music, it was soul." The applause rose again, more genuine this time, filled with admiration. The woman lowered her head modestly, her cheeks slightly flushed. The attention made her uncomfortable, but at the same time, she felt a small spark of warmth inside, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a stranger in the crowd, but as someone who had something to give. As the evening went on, people began to approach her. Some complimented her playing, others simply wanted to know her story. But she kept her answers short and humble. "It's been a long time since I played," she said to one man who couldn't stop praising her. "I didn't expect anyone to care." The pianist, still curious, eventually made his way to her table again. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to embarrass you." She looked at him, her eyes kind. "You didn't," she replied. "Maybe I needed a reason to play again." He smiled, almost relieved by her grace. "You were incredible," he said. "Your playing, it had something that's hard to explain. Most musicians focus on perfection. You focused on emotion. Every note you played told a story." The woman's expression softened. "That's all I ever wanted music to be, a way to tell a story." He leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "You said you used to play. Were you a performer?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "A long time ago," she said. "Before life got in the way." He wanted to ask more, but something about her tone told him not to. So instead, he said, "If you ever decide to play again, I'd be honored to share the stage with you." She chuckled quietly. "That's kind, but I don't think I belong on a stage anymore." "You belong exactly there," he said firmly, but with respect. "The world needs to hear what you have to say through your music." The woman didn't answer right away. She looked around the room. The glittering chandeliers, the polished floors, the elegant people who were now looking at her with admiration instead of indifference. For years she had avoided places like this, believing she didn't belong. But tonight had changed something inside her. As the crowd began to leave, the pianist stayed near her. They spoke for a few minutes more, their conversation quiet but meaningful. He learned that she had once been a music teacher, known for her ability to make her students feel the emotion in every note. But after her husband passed away, she had stopped playing altogether. Life had felt too heavy, and the piano had become a painful reminder of the dreams she'd set aside. The pianist listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said softly, "Music doesn't fade. It waits. And when you're ready, it returns." The woman smiled sadly. "Maybe tonight it did," he nodded. "It did. And you moved everyone here." After she left, the guests kept talking about her performance. Some said she played better than the famous pianist himself. Others called it a miracle. But to her, it wasn't about comparisons or praise. It was about rediscovering a part of herself that she thought was gone forever. That night, when she returned home, the streets were quiet. She walked slowly, her thoughts full of the music she had played. Her hands still felt the keys, her heart still felt the echo of the melody. When she reached her small apartment, she sat down near the window and looked out at the city lights. For years, she had lived quietly, going through her days without much joy or purpose. But now, something had shifted. She thought about the grand piano, the audience, the sound of applause. But more than anything, she thought about how it felt to play again, to express what words could never say. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from gratitude. She whispered to herself, "Maybe I wasn't meant to stop." The next morning, she woke early, the sunlight streaming through her curtains. Her fingers ached slightly, reminding her of the night before. She smiled at the feeling. For the first time in years, she felt a pull toward something more than routine. She went to her small bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album. Between the pages was a picture of her younger self sitting at a piano, smiling brightly. The sight brought back a flood of memories, the concerts, the students, the joy of teaching music to children who saw the world through sound. She closed the album gently and decided to visit the community center where she used to teach. The building was still there, though older now. The front door creaked as she entered, and she saw a few children gathered around an old upright piano. A young instructor was helping them play a simple tune. The instructor looked up, surprised to see her. "Can I help you?" he asked kindly. "I used to work here," she said. "A long time ago," he smiled. "You must be the one they told stories about, the teacher who made music come alive." She laughed softly, embarrassed. "I don't know about that." He gestured toward the piano. "Would you like to play something for them?" For a moment she hesitated again, just like the night before. But then she nodded. The children moved aside, curious and excited. She sat down, placed her hands gently on the keys, and began to play a simple melody, one she used to teach her students when they were afraid of making mistakes. The notes were soft, playful, and warm. The children watched in awe, their faces lighting up with joy. By the time she finished, they were clapping and laughing, asking her to play more. As she looked at their smiling faces, something inside her settled. This was where she belonged. Not in the spotlight, not surrounded by cameras or applause, but here, where music could inspire and heal. That night at the ballroom had reminded her that music was still part of her, and now she knew what to do with it. She didn't need fame or recognition. She just needed a piano, an audience, no matter how small, and a reason to play. Somewhere in another part of the city, the famous pianist thought about her too. He had told his manager about the woman from the party, describing her as one of the most talented and heartfelt musicians he had ever met. He didn't even know her name, but he knew he would never forget her performance. It wasn't about skill or fame. It was about truth, and he had seen it in her music. And so, two people from different worlds shared a quiet connection through a single night of unexpected music. It began as a joke, but it ended as a moment that neither of them would ever forget. Days passed, but the memory of that evening at the ballroom stayed fresh in the woman's mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the piano keys beneath her fingers and hear the sound of applause echoing faintly. It had been years since she had felt that kind of warmth inside her heart. The feeling didn't fade. Instead, it kept growing stronger, like a quiet flame that refused to go out. She started visiting the community center more often. The children there began to look forward to her visits, eager to learn new songs. The young instructor who worked there was always kind and welcomed her warmly. He encouraged her to teach the children, even though she wasn't officially part of the staff. And so slowly she began teaching again. Her days started to feel meaningful once more. Every morning she woke up with purpose. She would pack her small bag, bring her old sheet music, and spend hours helping the children learn how to express themselves through music. The laughter and chatter of those young voices filled the empty spaces in her heart that had been silent for too long. One afternoon, as she sat by the piano helping a little girl with her hand position, she noticed a familiar face standing in the doorway. It was the famous pianist. He was dressed casually this time, not like the night at the ballroom, and he carried no spotlight with him, just a genuine smile. She looked up in surprise. "You found me," she said softly. He nodded. "I had to," he replied. "That night you reminded me why I started playing music in the first place. I couldn't stop thinking about it." The children stared at him in awe, whispering among themselves. They recognized him from posters and television. He waved politely at them and stepped closer to the piano. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. "I asked around," he admitted with a grin. "People at the event said you used to teach. I thought maybe you'd be here. I wanted to thank you properly." "There's nothing to thank me for," she said modestly. "There is," he insisted. "You gave me something I'd lost, the heart in my playing. I realized I've been chasing perfection, not passion." The woman smiled. "Perfection fades. Emotion stays," he nodded slowly. "Exactly." He looked at the children and then back at her. "Do you mind if I sit in?" "Of course not," she said, moving aside to make space for him. The children giggled as the famous pianist sat beside her on the small wooden bench. He smiled at them and said, "How about we make some music together?" The next hour turned into something magical. The children played simple tunes while the two adults accompanied them. The woman guided their hands patiently, and the pianist added soft harmonies that made even the simplest song sound beautiful. The children's laughter filled the room, blending with the notes that danced through the air. When the lesson ended, he turned to her and said, "You're a natural teacher. You make people feel music, not just hear it." She looked down shyly. I used to think I lost that part of myself. He smiled gently. It never left you. It was just waiting for the right moment to return. They began to meet more often after that. Sometimes he would visit the center to help with lessons, and sometimes they would sit together at the piano, playing pieces they both loved. Their friendship grew naturally, built on shared respect and a deep love for music. It wasn't about fame or admiration anymore. It was about connection. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in soft orange light, they sat alone in the empty classroom. The children had gone home and the building was quiet. The woman played a gentle melody, something she had written years ago but never shared. Her fingers moved gracefully, the sound warm and soothing. When she finished, the pianist said softly, "That was yours, wasn't it?" She nodded. "I wrote it after my husband passed away. I couldn't bring myself to play it again until now." He was silent for a moment, then said, "It's beautiful. It feels like a conversation between love and loss." She looked at him and smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it is." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you ever perform it again? In front of people?" She shook her head. "I don't think I could." "Why not?" "Because it's personal. It's not meant for applause," he understood. He had spent his life performing for audiences, but he knew what she meant. Some music wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to heal. Over the next few weeks, word started to spread around the city about the community center and the mysterious woman who played like an angel. Parents began enrolling their children in classes, hoping they could learn from her. The once quiet place was now filled with laughter, piano notes, and excitement. One afternoon, a local reporter showed up, having heard about her story. She was hesitant at first, not wanting attention, but the pianist convinced her that maybe her story could inspire others who had given up on their passions. During the interview, she was asked what made her start playing again. She smiled softly and said, "A moment of kindness, or maybe curiosity, brought me back to music. I thought I was done, but life surprised me." When the article was published, it spread quickly. People were touched by her story, a reminder that it's never too late to return to what you love. Soon she started receiving letters from people who had once played music or painted or written, but had stopped due to life's hardships. They thanked her for inspiring them to try again. The pianist continued to visit, and one day he brought an idea. "There's a small charity concert next month," he said. "It's to raise funds for children's music programs. Would you consider performing one piece with me?" She laughed softly. "You don't give up, do you?" "Not when it comes to music," he said with a grin. "It's for the children. Think of it as sharing your gift, not performing." She thought about it for a while. The idea of playing in front of people again frightened her, but she also knew it wasn't about her anymore. It was about what music could do. Finally, she agreed. "Just one piece," she said. "Just one," he promised. When the day of the charity concert came, she felt her heart racing. The venue was smaller than the grand ballroom, but still filled with people. Parents, children, and supporters gathered to listen. The pianist gave her a reassuring smile as they took their seats on stage. As the lights dimmed, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The same calm, honest emotion that had touched everyone at the ballroom filled the room again. Her hands moved gracefully, her heart completely open. The audience sat in silence, captivated. When the piece ended, the applause was thunderous. She looked at the pianist beside her, and they both smiled, not because of the applause, but because of the feeling that music had brought them here again, together. After the concert, many people came up to thank her. Some said they cried during her performance. Others simply wanted to shake her hand. The pianist stood beside her, proud and respectful, introducing her not as someone he'd once teased, but as a friend and an artist who had inspired him. That night, as they walked outside, the air was cool and calm. The city lights shimmered in the distance. She looked at him and said quietly, "You know, I almost didn't play that night at the ballroom. If I had said no, my life would still be silent." He smiled. "I'm glad you said yes." She looked at him with gratitude. "So am I." From that moment on, their paths stayed connected. They didn't need grand stages or famous audiences. They simply kept playing, at schools, community events, and small gatherings. Each performance reminded them and everyone watching that music had the power to change hearts, heal wounds, and bring people together. And though the world still remembered her as the woman who surprised a famous pianist one night, she didn't think of it that way. To her, that night wasn't about shocking anyone. It was about rediscovering herself and remembering that some moments, even those born from a joke, can change a life forever. Months passed since the charity concert, but the memory of that night stayed alive in everyone's heart. The performance had touched so many lives, especially those who believed they had lost their dreams. The woman who once avoided the piano now found herself surrounded by music every day. Her lessons at the community center were full of laughter and inspiration. Children who had once been shy now played confidently, and even adults began visiting the center asking her to teach them. Music had brought new life not only to her but to everyone around her. The famous pianist continued to visit whenever his schedule allowed. Sometimes he would arrive quietly, sit in the back, and just listen to her teach. Other times he joined in, turning simple lessons into joyful duets that left the children cheering. The bond between them grew naturally, built not on fame or admiration, but on mutual respect and a shared love for music. One evening, as the sun was setting, the two sat together at the piano after everyone had gone home. The air was calm, and the light coming through the window bathed the room in golden warmth. The pianist looked thoughtful. "You've changed this place," he said softly. "When I first came here, it felt like a quiet old building. Now it's alive," she smiled. "The children did that. Their joy reminds me what music is really for." He nodded. "I've been thinking. I'm planning a new concert series. Not the kind with bright lights or luxury halls. Something different. Small performances in schools, hospitals, and community centers. I want to bring music to people who can't afford to hear it live." Her eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea." "I'd like you to join me," he said simply. She hesitated. "Me? I'm not a performer anymore." "You are," he said firmly. "You might not play for fame, but you play for hearts. And that's what this tour is about." She didn't answer immediately. The idea frightened her, but it also filled her with excitement. She hadn't traveled or performed outside the community in years. "I'll think about it," she said finally. He smiled. "That's all I ask." The next few days were filled with thought. The woman found herself standing by her window at night, imagining what it would be like to travel again, to play for strangers who might find hope in her music. She remembered the girl she once was, the one who believed music could change the world. Maybe it wasn't too late to be that person again. A week later, she gave him her answer. "I'll come," she said, "but only if it's truly about helping people." "That's the only reason," he assured her. And so their journey began. The first stop was a small town hospital. The room was filled with patients, nurses, and families. There was no grand stage, no fancy decorations, just a modest upright piano placed near a window. The woman took a deep breath as she sat down. When her fingers touched the keys, the same peace she always felt returned. The soft melody filled the air, and for a few moments everyone forgot their pain and worries. Some closed their eyes, some smiled, and a few even cried quietly. When the song ended, the room erupted in gentle applause. Afterward, a nurse came up to her and said, "You don't know what you just did." That melody made one of our patients smile for the first time in weeks. The woman's eyes filled with emotion. She realized then that music wasn't just sound. It was healing. From there, they traveled to schools where children clapped along to the rhythm. Then to old care homes where elderly listeners tapped their fingers, remembering songs from their youth. Each place they visited left a mark on her heart. People didn't know her story, but they felt her sincerity through her playing. At every stop, the famous pianist stood beside her, sometimes playing, sometimes watching proudly. He admired the way she connected with people so effortlessly. She didn't try to impress. She simply shared, and that made her unforgettable. One night, after a small concert at a school, they sat outside on a bench looking at the stars. The air was cool and the sound of distant laughter floated in the breeze. The pianist turned to her and said, "You know, before I met you, I played for applause. Every note was about perfection, but now I understand something deeper." She looked at him curiously. "And what's that?" "That music isn't about us, it's about the people who need it." She smiled softly. "Yes, when I lost everything, I thought music had left me. But it was waiting for the moment I'd stop playing for myself and start playing for others." He nodded. "That's what makes you special." Their tour continued for months. In each town, new faces greeted them and new stories unfolded. There was a boy who played along with them on a small toy keyboard, a grandmother who requested a lullaby she hadn't heard in decades, and a group of students who decided to start their own music club after watching them perform. Everywhere they went, the woman felt the same warmth she'd felt that first night at the ballroom, but this time it wasn't fleeting. It was steady, real, and shared with people who truly needed it. As their final stop approached, a performance at a children's hospital in the city, the pianist said, "After this, we should record an album. Not for sale, but to give to these places as a gift." She smiled. "I like that idea. Music that keeps giving, even when we're not there." When they arrived at the hospital, they were greeted by doctors, parents, and children in wheelchairs. The room was decorated with colorful drawings and balloons. The woman sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play a melody she had written especially for them. It was hopeful, full of light and warmth. The children clapped softly to the rhythm, and some even sang along. At one point, a small boy in the front row stood up and said, "When I grow up, I want to play like you." The woman paused and smiled warmly. "You will," she said, "because music doesn't belong to the best, it belongs to everyone who loves it." After the performance, as she was leaving, the boy's mother came up to her, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "My son hasn't been this happy in months." The woman held her hand gently. Then it was worth every note. Later that evening, back at the hotel, she sat by the window with the pianist beside her. They watched the city lights shimmer below. "You were right," she said quietly. "This journey was exactly what I needed," he smiled. "You've changed more lives than you know," she shook her head. "No, music did that. I just played the notes." He looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "No. You gave those notes meaning." The room fell silent for a while. The sound of the city hummed softly outside, blending with the faint echo of their memories. Finally, she turned to him and said, "Do you ever think about how strange life is? One joke, one small moment can change everything." He laughed softly. "I think about it all the time. I asked you to play just to make people laugh, but instead, I learned something that changed my whole life." She smiled. Then it was a good joke. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes from peace, not amusement. As the night grew darker, she thought about all the people they had met, all the music they had shared. Her journey had come full circle, from a quiet woman sitting unnoticed at the back of a ballroom to a teacher, performer, and friend who had brought light back into people's lives. And somewhere deep inside, she knew her husband would have been proud. The music she played now wasn't just for him or herself, it was for everyone who needed a reason to believe again. Before going to bed, she sat at the small piano in her room and played one last tune. It was a soft lullaby filled with gratitude. As the melody floated through the quiet night, she closed her eyes and smiled. Life had given her pain, silence, and loss, but it had also given her music, hope, and a second chance. And as the final note faded into the air, she whispered to herself, "Thank you, music, for finding me again." The following weeks after the tour were quiet. The woman returned to her small apartment in the city, a place that once felt lonely but now carried a different kind of silence, a peaceful one. Her piano sat by the window, polished and ready, waiting like an old friend. She no longer feared touching it. In fact, she played every morning, letting her fingers move freely, without pressure or expectation. Music had become her language again, the one she used to speak to the world without words. The famous pianist went back to his concerts and travels, but they kept in touch. They called often, sharing stories about their days, about the people they had met during the tour. There was a calm respect between them, and sometimes when they talked, they didn't even mention music. They spoke about life, how strange it was, how beautiful it could be when one stopped trying to control everything. One afternoon, the woman received a letter. It was from the city's cultural foundation. They had heard about her performances in hospitals and schools, and they wanted to honor her with an award for her contribution to music education and community service. She stared at the letter for a long time, overwhelmed by emotion. For years, she had lived in the shadows of her own grief. Now she was being recognized not for fame, but for heart. When she told the pianist, he was thrilled. "You deserve it," he said warmly. "This is the kind of recognition that truly matters." She smiled softly. "I never imagined something like this would happen. I didn't even think people knew who I was anymore," he replied gently. "People never forget kindness. They remember the way you make them feel. That's what your music does. The ceremony was small but beautiful. It took place in a modest hall filled with teachers, students, and families whose lives she had touched. When she stepped on stage, the audience rose to their feet. The applause wasn't deafening or wild. It was warm, sincere. She looked out and saw familiar faces. The little boy from the hospital, the elderly woman who had danced to her tune, the children from the community center. Every pair of eyes carried gratitude. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated for a moment, then began softly. I used to think music was something you did for recognition, for applause. But I learned that music is really something you give. It's a gift that travels from one heart to another. It can heal, it can comfort, and it can bring people together. I lost that truth once, but I found it again. Thanks to all of you. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When she finished, the audience stood again, clapping for a long time. The pianist sitting in the front row smiled proudly. After the event, they went for a walk in the city. The night was calm, and the streets glowed softly under the streetlights. The woman carried her small award in her hands, running her fingers over the engraved letters. It feels strange, she said. I don't see this as mine. It belongs to everyone who believed in me. He nodded. That's what makes you different. Most people chase awards. You treat them like reminders, not of success, but of purpose. They stopped by a small coffee shop, the same one where months ago they had met after that unforgettable concert. It was quiet inside, and the same waiter greeted them with a friendly smile. As they sat down, she looked around and whispered, Funny how life circles back. I came here once feeling invisible, and now everything feels so different. That's because you changed, he said. Not the world you, she nodded. Maybe both, they laughed softly. The conversation drifted easily like a melody without end. They talked about future plans. He had new performances lined up, but he wanted to include her again, perhaps in a special charity concert. We can call it Notes of Hope, he suggested. A night dedicated to everyone who believes music can heal. She thought for a moment. I like that. But if we do it, it has to be open to everyone. No tickets, no fancy clothes, just people who want to listen. Agreed, he said with a grin. It'll be our gift to the city. Over the next few months, they began preparing for it. They invited small local musicians, children from her community center, and even the young boy from the hospital, who now played his own tiny keyboard with pride. Posters went up across the city, not with pictures of grand halls or elegant gowns, but with drawings made by children and handwritten words, music for everyone. The night of the concert arrived. The venue was an open-air park decorated with strings of lights. People from all walks of life gathered, families, students, workers, and elderly couples. Some brought blankets, others sat on the grass. There was laughter, chatter, and a sense of togetherness that felt pure. When the woman walked onto the small stage, the crowd quieted. She looked out and smiled. Good evening, she said softly. Tonight there are no performers or audiences. There are only people who love music. Let's make this night one to remember. She began to play, her hands moving gracefully across the keys. The melody was soft at first, like a whisper, then grew stronger, filling the park with warmth. The pianist joined her, and their harmony was effortless, two souls speaking the same language. The children clapped along. The crowd swayed gently, and for a few moments, the world seemed to stop. As the night went on, other musicians joined in, a violinist, a flutist, even a group of young singers. The music blended perfectly, carrying joy through the air. People sang, laughed, and some even danced under the stars. It was not a concert in the traditional sense. It was a celebration of life. At one point, she stopped playing and looked around. The sight moved her deeply. The faces in the crowd glowed with happiness. There was no division, no pretense, just people united by sound. She turned to the pianist and whispered, This is what music is meant to be. He nodded, his eyes reflecting the same emotion. You were the heart of this night, he said. When the final piece ended, there was a long moment of silence, not because the audience didn't want to clap, but because they didn't want the moment to end. Then slowly applause began to rise, soft and genuine, spreading like a wave through the park. She stood up and bowed, tears glistening in her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly into the microphone. Thank you for reminding me that even after silence, music always returns. After the concert, as people began to leave, some came up to her just to shake her hand or say thank you. A woman with her daughter said, "Your music gave me hope. I was afraid to start over, but now I feel like I can." The woman smiled, touched beyond words. When everyone was gone, she and the pianist stayed behind, sitting on the edge of the stage. The lights hung above them, swaying gently in the night breeze. "You know," he said softly, "this might be my favorite concert of all time." "Mine too," she said, "because it wasn't just about music, it was about people." They sat there for a long while, listening to the faint echo of laughter and the soft hum of the city. The night felt complete, as if the music had wrapped around them like a gentle promise. When they finally stood to leave, she looked back at the piano, still shining under the soft lights. For a moment she thought about how far she had come, from that quiet woman who once sat unnoticed in a ballroom to someone who brought light into others' lives. The journey had been long, unexpected, and full of grace, and as they walked away together, she whispered softly to herself, "The music never ends. It just finds a new place to play." The morning after the concert, the woman woke up early. The sunlight streamed softly through the curtains, and the air outside carried the faint sound of birds. She sat up slowly, still feeling the echo of last night's melodies in her heart. The applause, the laughter, the smiles, they were all still with her like warm shadows that refused to fade. She walked to her piano and gently placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she didn't play. She just sat there listening to the quiet. The world outside was waking up, and the city hummed faintly in the distance. She took a deep breath and smiled. It felt like peace. Later that morning, the pianist came by to visit. He brought breakfast, coffee, fresh bread, and fruit, and set it on the table. They ate together, laughing softly about the little things that went wrong during the concert. A string that snapped, a microphone that cut out for a few seconds, a child who clapped too early. Yet they both agreed that none of it mattered. It was perfect in its imperfections. "You know," he said, sipping his coffee, "I think last night was the best performance I've ever been part of. It wasn't grand, but it was real," she nodded. "That's what made it beautiful. Everyone there came with open hearts. No expectations. Just love for the music," he smiled. "You made that happen." She shook her head gently. "No, we all did." The days that followed were filled with quiet contentment. She continued teaching at the community center, but now more people came than ever before. The children who had once watched her on stage were now her eager students. The little boy from the hospital had become her favorite pupil, always curious, always smiling, and always playing slightly too fast. The pianist often visited, sometimes joining her lessons, sometimes just watching from the back, smiling at how much she had changed. Her life had become fuller than she ever imagined, not because of fame or recognition, but because of the joy she had brought to others. One afternoon, while sitting by the window, she received a letter from a small town far away. It was from a school teacher who had attended their concert. The letter read, "Your performance changed something in me. I started a small music club for children here, and we meet every week. They remind me of what you said, that music belongs to everyone who loves it. Thank you for planting that seed." She read the letter twice, tears forming in her eyes. The impact of her music had reached places she'd never been. It made her realize that the beauty of giving is that it keeps moving forward, long after you think your part is done. The following weekend, she and the pianist met at a park, the same one where their open-air concert had been held. They sat on a bench watching families play and children chase balloons in the distance. The city was alive, full of sounds and laughter. "It feels strange," he said quietly, "to think how all of this began, with a joke. A silly moment in a ballroom," she smiled softly. "Life has a funny way of turning mistakes into miracles." He chuckled. "If I hadn't asked you to play that night, I would have missed out on something extraordinary." She looked at him, her eyes gentle. Maybe it was meant to happen. Maybe the world needed a reminder that talent doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it hides behind aprons and quiet smiles. He nodded thoughtfully. "You taught me that. I used to think music was about mastery, about being the best, but you showed me it's about being true." They sat there for a long while, not needing to fill the silence. The breeze carried the faint tune of a street musician playing nearby. The notes danced lightly through the air, imperfect but full of feeling. The woman closed her eyes and listened. It reminded her of her younger days, of all the times she had played not for others but for herself. "Do you ever miss the big stages?" he asked after a while. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Sometimes. But only the piano, not the lights. The stage made me feel important. The music makes me feel alive," he nodded. "That's beautifully said. It's just true," she replied softly. They walked along the path, talking about the future. The pianist had been invited to perform overseas and asked if she would come along. She hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of life again," she said. "You don't have to decide now," he replied. "Just think about it. Wherever you go, you carry your music with you. The world needs to hear it." That night she returned home and sat by her piano again. The moonlight streamed across the room, illuminating the keys. She began to play, slowly at first, then with more confidence. The melody was new, something that had been forming in her heart for a long time. It was soft but full of hope, a song about second chances, about rediscovering life after loss. She called it the Song of Tomorrow. As she played, she imagined all the people she had met along the way, the children, the patients, the teachers, the pianist. Every note seemed to hold a piece of their laughter, their dreams, their courage. It was as if their stories were flowing through her fingers. When she finished, she sat quietly, her hands resting on the keys. There were tears in her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. Life had given her pain once, but it had also given her a second melody, one written not from sorrow, but from love. Days turned into weeks, and soon her song began to spread. She recorded it at the community center with her students, and they shared it online. People from all over the world listened, writing messages of how it had comforted them in hard times. Some said it gave them courage to try again. Others said it reminded them of someone they loved. The pianist called her one evening. "Your song is everywhere," he said excitedly. "People are talking about it. You've started something beautiful again." She laughed softly. "It wasn't me. It was all of us. The world needed something peaceful, and maybe, just maybe, it came at the right time." He paused, then said, "You know, I think this is your true concert. Not in a hall, not in front of cameras, but in people's hearts." His words stayed with her for days. She realized that the greatest stage of all was life itself, and every day, each small act of kindness, each note of love, was its own performance. Months later, the city invited her to perform at a grand hall, the same one where everything had begun. This time it wasn't a joke. It was an honor. She stood on that familiar stage once more, looking out at a crowd that waited in silence. She smiled, remembering the night when laughter had filled this same room for a very different reason. The pianist sat beside her, ready to accompany her again. She leaned toward him and whispered, "Let's make this one count." "Always," he replied. They began to play, and the music filled the hall, soft, sincere, timeless. No one spoke, no one moved. Every note carried her story, their journey, and the lessons they had learned. It was not a performance meant to impress, but one meant to remind. Remind everyone that dreams never truly die, they just wait for courage to wake them. When the last note faded, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was long and heartfelt. She looked around, her heart swelling with emotion. The same piano that once symbolized her pain had now become her voice of hope. As she bowed, she thought to herself, "This isn't the end. It's another beginning." After the concert, as she left the stage, a little girl ran up to her holding a flower. "I want to play like you someday," the girl said shyly. The woman knelt down, smiling gently. "You will," she said. "Just promise me one thing, play with your heart, not your hands." The girl nodded and hugged her. It was a small moment, but for the woman it meant everything. That night, as she walked home under the soft glow of city lights, she felt complete. The journey that began as a joke had become a story of faith, kindness, and rediscovery. Music had not only given her back her purpose, it had connected her to countless souls across the world. Before going to bed, she played one last tune on her piano, the same melody she had named the Song of Tomorrow. The notes drifted through the quiet night, soft and golden, carrying a message she had learned through every twist of her story, that no matter how dark life becomes, there is always a song waiting to be played, and as the final note lingered in the air, she whispered with a smile, "Thank you, life. for letting me play again.